And today we are going to talk about the respiratory system, starting by looking at some of the main functions and anatomical structures associated with the system as a whole. So when we talk about respiratory system, you do need to understand that it is tightly closed to your cardiovascular system, and it is responsible for bringing in the oxygen that is required by your body, and at the same time remove the carbon dioxide that is produced by your cells and tissues through the process of exhalation. When we look at the processes associated with the respiratory system, there are four main processes. The first one is pulmonary ventilation, which simply put is the process of inhalation and exhalation. We have a process called external respiration, which implies the exchange of gases between your lungs and your blood vessels. So basically what takes place in your lungs to change blood from deoxygenated to oxygenated. You have a process called internal respiration, which is what's happening inside your body between the tissue and blood, where your tissue takes up the oxygen and gives up its CO2 to your blood. So basically, the internal respiration starts with the blood that is oxygenated and ends with the blood that is deoxygenated. And to make sure that the blood is effectively transported, the gases are effectively transported through your system. We already hinted at that earlier on when we talked about blood as a means of transport, with using words such as oxyhemoglobin, deoxyhemoglobin, and carbaminohemoglobin for transport of carbon dioxide. But we will review this in a little bit more detail and look at the reaction and the movement of these gases later on. Now, when we talk about the respiratory system, the main structures of the respiratory system include your nose and your nasal cavity, which is basically the cavity behind. You have the pharynx, which is also known as the throat. You have the larynx, which is known as the voice box, where you have your vocal cords. And then you have this tube that goes down the thoracic cavity, referred to as the trachea. And if you continue trachea branches off to your left and right lung to form bronchi. Now, if you continue forming and looking at the bronchi, you notice that the bronchi is actually continue to branch throughout to form a smaller and smaller branches. So the pattern that you see inside your lungs is known as the bronchial tree, which basically shows and represents the branching of the bronchi to transport the gases in and out of your lungs. Now, when we look at the respiratory system, we can break it down to the upper and lower respiratory tract. Upper respiratory tract, as it implies, is the superior part of the tract made up of your nose and nasal cavity, your pharynx or your throat, and the larynx, which is also known as the voice box. And the lower part of the respiratory tract is basically your trachea, which branches in to form your bronchial tree, again, the pattern that you see here. And the bronchial tree is located inside your lungs, so your lungs is also identified as the lower respiratory tract. So what do we need to know for each of these organs? Let's just start with your nose and your nasal cavity. So your nose is providing multiple functions. 3 of these functions are extremely essential for you guys to know. The other ones are somewhat self-explanatory. But these 3 parts you need to know and know which structure within your nose and nasal cavity carries out that process. So the air that comes into your nose needs to be filtered, so remove the dust and debris. It needs to warm up before it reaches the lungs, so basically you don't introduce very cold air into your lungs that can cause tissue damage. And inside your body you have a lot of fluid, so the air should not be dry when it enters your lungs. Again, it can cause damage. Consequently, the air needs to be moistened. So how do we accomplish this? If I want to filter the air, I use my hair inside the nose. To moisten the air, M for M, you're going to use the mucosal lining, which basically contains a significant amount of mucus. And as the air goes over that, that basically causes the air to become moist. And then warming up the air, we're relying on the submucosa, a layer underneath the mucosa that is very rich in blood vessels. And remember, blood vessels is at body temperature. So as this air is basically glancing over the submucosa, which is rich in blood, the air starts to warm up. Now, in addition to these three main functions that I've listed, nose also acts as a resonating chamber for the speech because it allows the air to come out of the lungs. And it also houses the olfactory receptors. Olfactory implies your sense of a smell. So the receptors that basically give your sense of a smell is located within the superior region of your nasal cavity. So let's continue looking at the nasal cavity. Within your nasal cavity, you have three structures which are referred to as conches, one on top, one in the middle, one on the bottom. So these conches have a very important function. The way you want to think about them is basically think about them as dents or indentations within your nasal cavity. Every time that you take a breath, this air basically going to create these turbulence inside your nasal cavity. Very similar to what you see when the air goes inside the valley between two mountains. So you had that whooshing sound, right? The turbulence associated with the air. And through that turbulence, you gain a few functions. One that is allows the sense of a smell, the molecules associated with the sense of a smell, to get close to your olfactory receptors and activate those receptors using their stimulants. It also, because it creates that turbulence, it provides an extra time for the air to warm up and moisten. And the last part that it also does is as it moves, as it circulates, it gives additional opportunities for the mucosal lining as well as the ciliated cells that line the nasal cavity to capture any of the dust particles that have not been filtered with your hair nose. So these three functions are essential to cleaning up and again making sure that the air, as it starts to go down, it's already been cleaned and it has very limited debris and dust particles that can cause harm to your lungs. Now, as we go through the respiratory system, we're continuing with pharynx. Pharynx is basically known as your throat. It is broken down to three parts depending on the region they are associated with. So if they are behind your nasal cavity, they're known as nasopharynx. This is your mouth, so if it's behind your oral cavity or your mouth, they refer to as the oropharynx. And if it's going close to your vocal cords, which we refer to as the larynx, it's called the laryngopharynx. So three parts for your pharynx. Now, this pharynx also includes the tonsils, which we talked about in the lymphatic system. They're part of the mouth and are responsible for basically identifying and fighting off any pathogen that gain access through either your mouth or your nose. Note that whenever I ask you to write the pathway of air through your respiratory system, make sure to include the three segmentations of the pharynx. We also have paranasal sinuses, which simply put are the cavities that are found inside the skull bones to lower the weight of the skull. we are naming these sinuses based on their association to the skull bones. So you have this bone that forms basically the majority of your forehead and the superior part of your skull, called the frontal bone, hence the name frontal sinuses. You have another bone that falls somewhere right here, and you can see it right here, and it goes a little bit higher. And this is known as the ethmoid bone, so it's the ethmoid sinus. A little bit below that, you have your sphenoid, which is right here, as well as this. This is called the sphenoid sinus. And if you guys remember, the upper portion of your jaw is called the maxilla. So this is called the maxillary sinus. Know the location, know where you can find them, and know the appropriate terminology. Now the next part within your respiratory path is your larynx or voice box. It is responsible for production of voice, as the name implies. It is a structure that opens up to the trachea, which basically means that the air can get in and out, and it has to pass through your larynx. And we'll talk about that, how your body actually is able to form sounds or create sounds by using these two vocal cords. So let's take a look at some of the information you need to know for the larynx. So the larynx is a very cartilaginous structure. It has a lot of muscles and tissue surrounding it as well. And the way you want to look at it is, if this is your larynx, it contains 4 major cartilages. And these cartilages are listed here, so let's go over them. The largest one you see right here, so this one, this is known as the thyroid cartilage. In men, thyroid cartilage is more pronounced, and therefore it is visible from under the skin, and it's called the Adam's apple. Inferior to that, you have this this cartilage that kind of goes around, called the cricoid cartilage. And if I look from the superior view, so if I'm looking at the superior view, then you see, which is this view right here, you see 2 additional cartilages that are forming the internal structure. The first one, which is the larger one, is this one, called the arytenoid cartilage. And these fang-shaped cartilages, which are called the corniculate cartilage. So in this picture, this V shape that you see right here is your thyroid cartilage. The round one that's below it is your cricoid cartilage. And again, the bigger one of the 2 inner one is the arytenoid cartilage. And then little tiny fang one is the corniculate cartilage. Now, notice that there are 2 strings attached to this. These 2 strings right here. These 2 strings here are your vocal cords. And you can see them when all the tissues are surrounding the structure in white. The gap you see between them right here, this gap right here, is known as the glottis. So, if the 2 vocal cords are far apart from each other, then glottis is open, which means air can easily get in and out. And if the vocal cords are really close together, then, or within each other's proximity, then glottis is closed, and that is very important in a sense of production of voice. So let's take a look at this. Here is an example of the vocal cords. So what you have here is an open glottis. So this space right here is the glottis. This is open, and this is happening when you want to allow the air basically move in and out of your lungs. So glottis stays in an open position. However, if you want to create a sound, and what you want to have is the air to come out of your trachea. You want the air to come out of the trachea, and when it comes out, you're going to bring your 2 vocal cords really close together. So you will have a tiny gap right in between them. Now, as the air is coming and is trying to escape between the gap, which is your glottis, that tiny gap between them, it's going to cause the vibrations of your two vocal cords, and that vibration giving you the ability to create sound. So, reviewing this one more time. When you are breathing air in and out, your two vocal cords are apart from each other, keeping the glottis open for easy flow of air. When you are trying to speak, the two vocal cords are coming to proximity with each other, so glottis is closed. Air escapes between the two vocal cords, causing their vibration. As a result, that vibration causes the creation of sound. Now, in addition to what we talk about, if this is right here is your vocal cord, right on top of this, you have this flap called the epiglottis. So this flap you see right here is covering the surface of the larynx and eventually your trachea. In this picture, if you go back to this picture, which is a good representation, you see right here, this is your epiglottis. This flap right here is the epiglottis. The tube that is running in front, that is wide open, that's your trachea. And then you also see a tube running in the back, that's a smaller one, a smaller diameter, muscular tube, which is known as the esophagus. So, if you start to eat something, food comes down from your mouth, oral cavity, gets here, and it has two pathways, two options for the pathway. You can take the open tube, which is wide open always, easy access, right? Food can go down this tube. Or it can try to go down the more muscular tube, which is relatively narrow. Logically, your food wants to take the larger tube, but that's the path for your air. So how do you protect your air passageway from food? That's where the epiglottis comes into play. Epiglottis, when you're eating, comes down and covers this surface. So it blocks your trachea from basically allowing food to enter. So the only passage your food has now is going down your esophagus. So you know when they tell you not to eat and talk, what is happening? When you talk, air is coming off the trachea and it wants to escape your trachea and again hit your vocal cords and come out. That gives you the ability to talk. But while you're eating, epiglottis wants to close up and cover the trachea, so you basically don't allow the food to pass through. So you're creating this dilemma for your epiglottis. Should you stay open or close? For most times, it actually figures the time that allows you to basically eat and talk at the same time. But sometimes epiglottis move fails, and as a result, epiglottis remains open when it's supposed to be closed and causing the person to basically choke on their food. And the next structure we're going to talk about is your trachea. Trachea is also known as the windpipe. It is the tube that you see going down your throat right here. Now, as I mentioned, trachea needs to stay open at all times. So to ensure that trachea is always open, you implant inside the trachea these blue lines, which are made up of hyaline cartilage. So in reality, if you take a look at their shape is like this, C shape. So this is the trachea. This, what you see as red, is your C-shape hyaline cartilage. And in the back, what I draw as this line, that would be a type of muscle referred to as the trachealis muscle. And I'll talk about that in a minute. Now, lining up your trachea, you have cells that are considered to be goblet cells. And these are the ones that also produce mucus to moisten the air. But majority of the cells are identified as pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. Pseudostratified means there are fake stratified, which means they're only actually made up of single layer. Ciliated implies that they have really tiny hairs that project off of them. And columnar implies that these are the long cells. So, what is the goal of pseudostratified ciliated columnar cells? They are to trap any debris that has escaped your nose and your nasal cavity before those dust particles can reach your lungs. Now, this is the picture you see here, is a superior view of the neckline. So what you have, which is the open tube right here, that's the trachea. And the tube you see in the back, that's the esophagus. Notice the blue lines that you see right here is the C-shaped hyaline cartilage. And what you see in the back, what I draw on a previous slide, is the trachealis muscle. Trachealis muscle is a smooth muscle that basically brings the two ends of the hyaline cartilage together. And its job is to basically control the diameter of the trachea. So, if this muscle is contracting, then these two ends would be closer together. So it would be like, say, here and here. The two ends would be closer together and causing the air passageway to get smaller. You can also relax the trachealis muscle, which opens up the air passageway. So, when you cough, let's say something is enlarged in your throat, or there's built up of mucus that you need to basically cough up. So what happens during that? Trachealis muscle is going to contract, so this muscle contracts and this opening gets smaller. So at the same time, you start to bring a lot of air out of your lungs and up the trachea, which means air is going to move more rapidly because of the smaller tube and the fact that you're pushing more air. That pressure that's building up in the trachea is going to help remove any debris or mucus or food that has been lodged in the throat. Okay, I'm going to stop here and then we'll continue with the next PowerPoint later.